In some late and uneasy traditions, the last sound before the ark is sealed is not thunder. It is a name, not Shem, not Ham, not Japheth. Another name, spoken into wet wind, as if one place in Noah's household still stands open and unresolved. Genesis never gives us that scene. It never gives us that sun. And yet, around the edges of the flood story, voices from later centuries keep circling the same disturbing thought. What if the world after the waters was not as cleanly reset as the Bible's short genealogy seems to say? The power of the flood story in Genesis rests partly in its brutal clarity. A corrupt world collapses. One man finds favor with God. One ark rises above judgment. One family survives. The line of humanity narrows to 8 souls, and from those 8, the nations of the earth spread again. It is simple, severe, ordered, but the ancient world did not always tell sacred history with that kind of clean edge. It lived among rival memories, local legends, broken tablets, tribal claims, priestly traditions, and songs older than the kingdoms that preserved them. When later readers looked at Noah, they did not all see a shut case. Some saw a missing figure, some saw a hidden branch, some saw a dangerous memory that official scripture refused to keep. To ask whether Noah had a 4th son is not only to ask about one extra person in a genealogy, it is to disturb the whole architecture of the flood. If another son existed, why is he absent? If a hidden branch survived, what survived with it? Bloodline, rebellion, knowledge. If the flood was meant to end an age of violence and corruption, what does it mean if something from that age passed through judgment untouched? That question matters because in the world of Genesis, genealogy is never mere record-keeping. Family lines carry promises, curses, land, priesthood, language, and memory. To alter a line is to alter the story of the world. The mystery grows darker when the Bible itself leaves certain tensions unresolved. Before the flood, Genesis 6 speaks in cryptic language about the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim, figures remembered as mighty men of old. After the flood, the Bible later speaks again of giant peoples, the Anakim, the Rephaim, and Og, king of Bashan, whose bed is described with almost taunting sighs in Deuteronomy. The text never explains in direct terms how such figures belong to a world that was supposedly purged of all old corruption. Later, readers noticed, ancient storytellers noticed, rabbis noticed, and once a question like that enters tradition, it rarely disappears. It grows names, it grows theories, it searches for a body to carry its burden. So the legend of a 4th son appears not in the strong daylight of the canonical text, but in the half-light where scripture meets interpretation. In some retellings, the lost son bears a name like Ner or Yonit. In other circles, the figure merges with Canaan, not as Ham's son, but as a more ancient and troubling child in Noah's own house. Elsewhere, the question is not framed as missing family at all, but as surviving forbidden knowledge, secret roots, giant blood, or a refuge beyond the ark. These stories do not agree with one another. They are not equal in age or value. Some are very late, some are openly legendary. Yet taken together, they reveal a real anxiety in the religious imagination of the ancient and late ancient world. Was the flood total, or only total in the way sacred history needed it to be? That is where this story becomes worth following. Not because a secret son can be proven with ease. He cannot. Not because suppressed truth always hides behind official silence. It does not. But because the strange afterlife of Noah's family opens a door into how biblical people and later readers wrestled with evil, survival, memory, and the stubborn return of what judgment was supposed to remove. The lost son, whether man or symbol, stands at that door. He asks whether the old world ended as fully as Genesis declares. He asks whether some things can be drowned and some things cannot. And he asks why the Bible, which sometimes preserve awkward truths with shocking honesty, would leave no room at all for a 4th name. To understand that silence, we have to begin where the text itself begins. with 3 sons named again and again as if the repetition is part of the point. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. 3 lines, 3 branches, 3 anchors for the table of nations. The mystery of the 4th son does not start in what Genesis says too little. It starts in how firmly Genesis seems to insist that it has said enough. Chapter 2 Genesis is not casual when it names Noah's sons. In Genesis 5, before the flood narrative reaches its full force, Noah is said to be 500 years old and to father Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In Genesis 6, when God announces the coming judgment, those same sons stand beside Noah as part of the household that will enter the ark. In Genesis 7 and 8, as the flood rises and falls, the family is counted again. In Genesis 9, after the waters recede, the sons return once more to the foreground, and the chapter soon turns to the episode that will shape the futures of Ham and Canaan. Then, Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, unfolds from those same 3 lines. This is not a place where an editor seems absent-minded. The triad is structural. It is the skeleton of the post-flood world. That matters because biblical genealogies are often selective, but they are rarely careless. The Old Testament can skip generations. It can compress lines. It can highlight only the ancestors needed for a covenant story. But when a genealogy is being used to map the nations of the earth, selection becomes theological. Israel's scriptures are telling their readers where peoples come from, how lands were settled, and how divine order was restored after chaos. 3 sons become more than a family detail. They become the frame by which the human world is redrawn. To add a 4th line is not a small adjustment. It would change the pattern beneath the map. This is one reason most mainstream readers, Jewish and Christian alike, have never felt a need to search for another son. The text appears settled. The burden of proof lies heavily on anyone who says otherwise. And historically speaking, that burden remains heavy. There is no ancient Hebrew manuscript of Genesis that suddenly produces a hidden 4th name in Noah's house. There is no Dead Sea cave where a clean alternate genealogy waits to overthrow the familiar one. The canonical text, as we have it, is clear. If a 4th son existed in older tradition, he left no secure trace in the main line of Genesis transmission, and still the silence itself invited speculation. Ancient interpreters were not modern historians. They did not only ask what a text stated, they also asked why it stated it this way, what it left out, what tensions it created, and how other traditions might help fill the gaps. This is especially true of stories like the Flood, which were already part of a wider Near Eastern memory world. When readers heard Genesis say that all flesh outside the ark perished, they remembered other flood tales. When they heard that Noah's 3 sons repopulated the world, they noticed peoples, myths, and giant traditions that seemed to reach back into something older and darker than a clean restart. Questions gathered in the margins. Some later writings attributed to ancient authorities helped feed those questions. One example often cited in popular discussions is the so-called Book of Jasher. The Bible mentions a Book of Jasher in Joshua and 2 Samuel, but the work available under that name today is much later and cannot be treated as a straightforward witness from Noah's age. That point is important. Too many theories build castles on books whose own foundations are unstable. Yet even a late retelling can reveal what readers in a later age found plausible or troubling. If traditions around Jasher or other retellings imagine missing names or altered family relations, they do not prove Genesis was changed. They do show that Noah's household did not stay untouched in the imagination of later communities. The same is true of linguistic hints that some interpreters press too hard. From time to time, people claim that certain plural forms in Hebrew suggest survivors beyond Noah's immediate family. Those arguments are rarely persuasive to scholars, and they often ask more from grammar than grammar can give. But the very desire to search for such clues tells us something. It tells us that the biblical story carries a pressure point. readers who feel the return of giants after the flood, or who sense that ancient civilization appears too suddenly in the memory of the old world, begin looking for cracks in the official wall. They search in words, names, and numbers because they suspect the wall was built to hold back something dangerous. That suspicion becomes stronger in the chapter after the flood, when Noah lies uncovered in his tent and Ham sees his father's nakedness. The punishment that follows falls not on Ham directly but on Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. That choice has puzzled interpreters for centuries. Why curse the son for the father's act? Later Jewish tradition generated many answers, some moral, some biological, some political. But for readers already haunted by the possibility of a hidden line, the curse of Canaan looked like evidence that something older and more polluted stood behind the story. If Canaan represented a line already marked before the nations were named, then perhaps the genealogy of Genesis 10 was not merely explaining the world. Perhaps it was containing it. For now, the cautious judgment must remain simple. The biblical text gives us 3 sons, not 4. On that point, it is firm. The mystery begins not because the Bible secretly says more, but because later traditions, unresolved tensions, and the strange aftershocks of the flood story kept persuading people that 3 names were not enough to explain the world they thought they had inherited. Chapter 3. Once the story leaves the firm ground of Genesis, the landscape changes, the air gets thicker, names multiply, texts no longer march in a single line. They glance off one another, borrow, distort, and answer questions the Bible itself never asks. This is where the 4th son lives, if he lives at all. Not as a clear historical person standing in plain sight, but as a figure assembled from fragments, anxieties, and rival memories that gathered around Noah over many centuries. Among the most important of those fragments are Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, the era when Israel lived under foreign empires and thought deeply about the presence of evil in history. In that world, Genesis 6 became a major problem. The brief biblical mention of heavenly beings, human women, and mighty offspring was too charged to leave alone. Texts like 1 Enoch expanded the story of the Watchers, fallen beings who crossed a boundary set by God and taught humanity forbidden arts, metalwork, enchantments, warfare, ornament, signs of the heavens. This mattered because it linked corruption not only to violence but to knowledge. Evil was no longer just bad behavior, it was instruction, transmission, a legacy passed from one generation to another. In the Book of Giants, known from fragments at Qumran and from other traditions farther east, the world before the flood becomes even more unsettled. Giant offspring dream of doom. A figure named Mahaway travels as a messenger. Judgment is coming, and no earthly strength can stop it. Texts do not present Mahaway as Noah's 4th son. That claim goes beyond what the evidence can bear. But they do preserve a world in which lineages outside Noah's immediate household matter deeply, especially lineages touched by heavenly rebellion. For later readers hungry to explain the survival of giant traditions after the flood, this was fertile ground. If some tainted branch endured, then perhaps the memory of a missing son was one way of saying so. Other traditions push the idea in different directions. In some later retellings and fringe genealogies, a 4th son is named directly. The names vary, which is itself a warning sign. A tradition that cannot preserve the same name is not one standing on solid historical footing. Yet the instability of the names also shows that the deeper interest may not have been the man himself. It may have been what he carried. The 4th son becomes a vessel for whatever later communities most feared or most needed to explain. The survival of giants, the transmission of secret arts, the curse upon Canaan, or the strange speed with which civilization seems to reassemble after the flood. Mandean literature, much later and shaped by its own religious world, adds another strange echo. There we meet figures associated with hidden knowledge, sacred names, and secret paths of preservation. These writings are not independent proof of Noah's family history. They belong to a late and complex environment in Mesopotamia, where biblical characters had already been reimagined many times. But they keep alive a pattern that appears across other traditions too. The flood does not only divide Old World from New World. It becomes the place where certain communities imagine a protected remnant of knowledge surviving through concealed channels. That idea deserves careful handling. Modern readers often treat forbidden knowledge as a thrill device, a shortcut to mystery. Ancient people treated it with more moral seriousness. Knowledge was never neutral in these stories. The arts taught by the Watchers were not evil because skill itself was evil. They were dangerous because power had moved faster than wisdom, and heaven's order had been forced open by beings who did not have the right to teach what they taught. If a hidden son of Noah carried such knowledge beyond the flood, he would not be a harmless footnote. He would represent the old rebellion moving forward under a new sky. This helps explain why later storytellers could link the fourth son with Canaan. In the Bible, Canaan's descendants become peoples Israel will confront in the land. They are morally and politically loaded figures in Israel's memory. To place Canaan closer to Noah, or even to blur him with a lost son, is to intensify that charge. It says the contamination did not begin later in the line. It was present from the moment the ark rested. That is powerful as myth-making, even if it remains weak as history. Communities often pull hated enemies backward into primeval time. They do it to explain present conflict as the fruit of an ancient corruption. So what are we left with? Not proof, not a forgotten verse waiting to be restored. We are left with a cluster of traditions that all circle the same fear. That judgment did not erase every dangerous inheritance. A son, a grandson, a giant messenger, a keeper of names, a bearer of hidden arts, an excluded line that still survives. These are not identical stories, and forcing them into one neat theory does violence to them. But if we let them remain diverse, they tell us something important. Across Jewish, sectarian, and neighboring religious worlds, the flood kept generating the same pressure. People wanted to know whether evil had truly been drowned, and if not, how it passed through the break. The fourth son is one answer to that question. Not the only answer, not the safest answer, but one that refuses to go away. Chapter 4 long before Israel's scribes shaped Genesis into the form we know. Flood stories were already moving through the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamia, rivers were both lifelines and threats. A flood was not an abstract symbol there. It was seasonal fear, civic memory, and cosmic warning all at once. So when we place Noah beside figures like Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, we are not saying the Bible copied a pagan myth in some crude way. We are saying the biblical flood entered a world where catastrophic waters already carried meaning, and where survival stories often preserved more than one line of memory. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives a divinely sent flood, and carries the burden of having lived through the end of a world. In Atrahasis, the problem behind the flood is tied to human noise, divine irritation, and the regulation of life itself. These stories differ sharply from Genesis in theology and moral shape, yet they share basic furniture: a chosen survivor, a great vessel, bird sent out, a landing after judgment, sacrifice after deliverance. That shared furniture tells us ancient people did not think of flood memory as a private possession of one nation. It was part of a larger civilizational inheritance. That wider inheritance matters because flood traditions often preserve extra people, extra knowledge, or extra routes of survival. Mesopotamian texts do not give us Noah's fourth son, but they do remind us that the biblical version is not the only way ancient people imagine the end of an age. Some stories allow wider households. Some give more attention to craft, building, and divine instruction. Some connect post-flood life with the recovery of kingship, agriculture, and sacred order. When later readers wondered whether Genesis had narrowed a broader memory, They were reading in a world where narrowing was imaginable. Then there are the flood echoes beyond Mesopotamia, Greek stories of Deucalion and Pyrrha, Indian traditions of Manu, flood memories in parts of the ancient Near East and farther afield. It is easy to abuse such comparisons, piling them together, as if every watery legend proves the same event in the same form. They do not. Human societies often tell stories of destruction and renewal. Similar themes do not erase difference. Yet the persistence of flood memory across cultures helps explain why later religious thinkers could imagine survival taking more than one shape. A mountain refuge here, a hidden passage there, a sacred instruction preserved somewhere else. Once that idea is in the air, Noah's closed household no longer feels like the only possible ending. For some interpreters, this became a way to explain early civilization itself. How, they asked, do cities, law codes, temple systems, astronomy, and metalwork appear so quickly in the dawn after the flood? The question is often stated too simply. Human cultures did not spring from nothing overnight, and archaeology does not support the fantasy of one single moment when all advanced knowledge suddenly burst into view. Still, ancient readers were not wrong to sense continuity. Civilizations remember, skills travel, practices endure. If the flood marked a radical break, then continuity demanded explanation. One answer was ordinary human survival and rebuilding. Another, more dramatic answer was the preservation of old world knowledge through special carriers. This is where the lost son becomes more than family. He becomes memory embodied. In some speculative traditions, he is the bearer of techniques traced back to the Watchers. Astronomy, architecture, metallurgy, ritual formulas, the ordering of cities. Such claims cannot be proved by tablets or bones. They belong to a mythic interpretation of culture, not to secure historical reconstruction, but they reveal how ancient and late ancient people thought about civilization. Great skill was often imagined as inherited, not invented from scratch. If knowledge seemed too refined to begin in ruins, perhaps it had crossed the flood hidden in a bloodline. Even the geography of survival fed that imagination. The Ark lands on the mountains of Ararat, a broad highland region in biblical thought, not a neat pin on a modern map. Highlands, caves, and remote places naturally attracted legends of preservation. The ancient Near East was full of rugged spaces where memory could hide what formal narrative excluded. Underground refuges, mountain shelters, holy names guarded by a few initiates, wise men who emerge after catastrophe carrying arts from before the disaster. All of this fits an old storytelling pattern. The flood did not just destroy, it sorted. It buried some things and surfaced others. So when people speak of a fourth son surviving outside the ark, they are not only making a claim about Noah, they are drawing on a much older habit of thought. Catastrophe does not always erase every branch. Official histories often present clean beginnings because communities need them. But real cultural memory is rarely clean. It is layered, it leaks, it stores rival versions in neighboring traditions, in sectarian books, in foreign epics, and in the stubborn return of questions that the main story cannot quite put down. That does not mean the rival versions are true. It means the mystery has a world in which it makes sense. And once that world is visible, the figure of the hidden son stops looking like a random invention. He becomes a response to a broad and ancient human instinct. When a civilization says everything changed, listeners start asking what did not. Chapter 5, the strongest pressure on the flood story, does not come from apocryphal names. It comes from giants. Genesis 6 places the Nephilim before the flood, in the age of violence that leads to judgment. That is difficult enough. But later books of the Bible speak about giant peoples in the land. The Anakim in Numbers and Joshua, the Rephaim in several places, and Og, king of Bashan, whose huge bed becomes a monument to survival from another age. The Bible does not pause to solve the puzzle for us, it simply moves forward. Yet for many readers, ancient and modern, the question hangs there with almost physical weight. If the old world was washed away, why does the new world still cast such long shadows? Some answer by saying the giant language is exaggerated. Ancient warfare remembered enemies through scale. A people can feel gigantic without being literal monsters. That is often true. Memory makes foes taller. Poetry hardens reputation into body, but not every reader was satisfied with that answer, especially in traditions already shaped by one Enoch and the stories of the Watchers. For them, the giant clans of Canaan were not only military threats, they were signs that something from the world before the flood had crossed into the world after it. This is where Canaan becomes central. In Genesis 9, Noah's curse falls not on Ham, but on Canaan. The text offers no long explanation. It simply marks Canaan for servitude in a way that later history and later interpretation would use, often cruelly and unjustly. We have to be careful here. Many terrible readings of this passage have been used to justify oppression, especially by confusing Canaan with whole peoples the text never had in mind. But within the internal logic of Genesis, the focus on Canaan does create a strange narrowing. Something about this branch is singled out early, before the nations spread in chapter 10. Later readers tried to explain that narrowing by reaching behind the story. Some rabbis imagined an offense that damaged Noah's future generations. Some connected the curse to illicit sexual disorder. Some let the punishment fall on Canaan because he was already implicated in the act. And some traditions, moving far beyond the plain sense of Genesis, began to collapse the distance between Canaan the grandson and a more primal corrupted line. In those readings, Canaan becomes almost a title for contamination itself, a surviving current of rebellion flowing out from the flood instead of ending in it. The legend of Og intensifies the problem. In the Bible, Og appears as a giant king east of the Jordan, one of the last of the Rephaim. In later Jewish tradition, he grows into something much stranger. Some stories claim he survived the flood by clinging to the outside of the ark, or by some special arrangement. These tales are clearly legend, not scripture. They solve a textual tension by inventing a dramatic image. But the image matters. It is memorable because it says what many interpreters feared. The ark carried salvation inside, but outside it, corruption still found a handhold. This is exactly the kind of symbolic space where a fourth son could take root. If people believed old world strength, violence, or giant blood had somehow persisted, they needed a channel. A hidden son, an ambiguous grandson, a line too dangerous to honor openly, a branch cursed before history fully begins. These ideas let later communities explain the return of the enemy not as a fresh outbreak but as a continuation. The wars of Israel were then tied to primeval judgment. Canaan was not just a land. It was the old disorder meeting the covenant people once again. Still, a responsible telling must say what the evidence allows and what it does not. The Bible never says Canaan was Noah's fourth son. It says Canaan was Ham's son. The giant traditions after the flood are real within Scripture. But the mechanism by which they relate to Genesis 6 is left uncertain. Later texts offer explanations, but they do not speak with one voice. Some blame renewed angelic rebellion. Some assume giant language is cultural memory rather than biology. Some fold everything into the cursed line of Canaan. The silence of the canonical text may be frustrating, but it is also instructive. It leaves room for tension without rewarding every attempt to close it, and yet tension has power. In the minds of ancient readers, unresolved tension often meant the story was deeper than the surface. Why curse Canaan? Why do giant peoples remain? Why do the most threatening enemies of Israel seem wrapped in memories of an age that was supposed to be gone? The fourth son emerges from that knot of questions. He gives those questions a body, a genealogy, and a face. He may not be historical in any strict sense, but as a figure of interpretation, he is almost inevitable, because once people suspect that the flood did not end everything it judged, they start looking for the one branch that carried the old world forward. And in many traditions, that branch grows toward Canaan. Chapter 6. If the hidden sun carries anything through the flood besides blood, it is knowledge. That is one reason the theory has held such power in modern imagination. A lost branch of Noah's family does not merely explain giants or curses. It promises to explain civilization itself. It says, the world after the waters was not rebuilt by frightened farmers learning again from scratch, but by heirs who still possessed pieces of an older and more dangerous wisdom. At first, that idea sounds attractive because it makes history feel dramatic, but it is older and more serious than modern fantasy. In ancient Jewish tradition, the problem of forbidden knowledge begins before the flood. The Watchers in 1 Enoch are condemned not only for crossing into human sexuality, but for teaching arts that disordered human life. Weapons intensify violence. Cosmetics intensify vanity and seduction. Astrological and magical knowledge intensify control, fear, and rebellion. Whether we share those judgments or not, the principle is clear. Some knowledge, passed at the wrong time and in the wrong way, becomes part of the corruption that brings judgment. Now place that idea beside the rise of ancient civilizations. Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the cultures of the wider ancient world appear in memory as astonishingly organized. They build cities, track stars, shape metal, erect monuments, and preserve sacred order through scribes and priests. Modern archaeology explains this through long human development, exchange, adaptation, and environment. It does not need a hidden son of Noah to account for planning or mathematics. But ancient people did not think like archaeologists. They thought genealogically and theologically. Skill came from somewhere. Order came from somewhere. If a world had once been judged for violent, heaven-touched excess, then the persistence of advanced skill after that judgment demanded a moral explanation. So in later retellings, the fourth son becomes a practical carrier, not a prophet in the covenant line, not the father of the faithful, more like a transmitter. He preserves techniques, names, measurements, star lore, ritual fragments, and forms of rule. This is why some stories portray him less as a beloved child and more as an uneasy inheritance. He is what survives because it knows how to survive. He is culture without purity, skill without covenant, memory without repentance. Through him, the old world reappears not as open blasphemy, but as useful knowledge that nations gladly receive. There is a dark realism in that idea. Human beings rarely inherit only the good from their ancestors. We inherit methods, ambitions, appetites, and systems of power too. The Bible itself often shows this. Cain builds a city. Tubal-Cain works bronze and iron. Egypt stores grain and crushes slaves. Babylon masters grandeur and pride at once. Skill is real, achievement is real, so is corruption. Later traditions that connect Noah's lost son with preserved knowledge are not simply trying to make the world more mysterious. They are trying to explain why culture can be brilliant and bent at the same time. This may also be why some versions of the mystery place the fourth son outside the favored line from the beginning. Shem becomes the ancestor linked, in biblical memory, to the covenant path that will eventually lead toward Abraham. Japheth opens outward toward other peoples. Ham's lines, especially through Canaan, become tangled in conflict with Israel. A secret fourth branch would fit perfectly as the repository for what sacred history does not want to endorse, but cannot deny the world possesses. Power, technique, ambition, sacred law cut loose from obedience. And yet there is a danger here. It is easy to turn the whole question into a grand conspiracy in which priests erased evidence, scholars hid manuscripts, and official religion buried humanity's true origin story. That is not serious history. Texts are lost for many reasons. Traditions mutate because communities retell them, not always because a central authority is cleansing the record. The rise of civilization is not a puzzle that only mythic bloodlines can solve. And the Bible's focus on covenant is not proof that it was suppressing embarrassing science. If we are going to walk through this mystery responsibly, we have to resist the thrill of total explanation. Still, the persistence of the idea tells us something deep. People sense that the flood story is about more than rain and rescue. It is about what kind of world can begin again after judgment. Can humanity start over without carrying forward the very tools that helped ruin the first world? Can skill be separated from pride? Can memory be preserved without rebellion being preserved with it? These are not fringe questions. They are human questions. The hidden son matters because he becomes the story's answer in flesh. He is the return of continuity when theology prefers rupture. By the time cities rise again and towers reach upward, the old argument has already returned in another form. Is human greatness a blessing rightly ordered under God, or is it always trying to rebuild Babel? The lost son belongs inside that argument. He stands behind the workshop, the tablet house, the royal court, the shrine, the weapons forge. Not as a proven ancestor, but as a symbol of the fear that judgment can break a world and still leave its habits alive. That fear is one reason the mystery has never stayed buried. Chapter 7. If later generations imagined a fourth son, why would the canonical text refuse him so completely? That question often tempts people toward dramatic answers. They picture councils of priests cutting names from scrolls, or rulers scrubbing out a bloodline that threatened religious control. Reality is usually less theatrical and more revealing. Sacred texts are shaped by communities that know exactly what kind of story they are trying to tell. What Genesis preserves and what it leaves outside its frame tells us less about censorship in the modern sense and more about theology, identity, and the danger of mixed boundaries. Genesis is fiercely interested in distinction. Light from darkness, waters above from waters below, clean from unclean, blessing from curse, line from line. Again and again, order is made by division. The flood itself is a return of chaos, a kind of anti-creation in which the boundaries collapse and the deep breaks loose. The world after the flood must therefore be told as reordering. A small faithful remnant survives. The lines are named, the nations unfold. To introduce a shadow branch carrying the old corruption inside the very first family would undercut that pattern at its root. It would say the new creation begins already compromised. In one sense, of course, Genesis already says that. Noah becomes drunk. Ham's offense follows quickly. Babel rises not long after. Sin survives the flood because the human heart survives the flood. The Bible is too honest to deny that. But there is a difference between moral weakness and genealogical ambiguity. Genesis can admit the persistence of sin while still insisting on the clarity of the new human map. 3 sons are enough for that map. A fourth son tied to the old hybrid violence of Genesis 6 would blur the reset too much. It would make post-flood history feel contaminated by design. This is why the mystery touches such a sensitive nerve in monotheistic thought. The Bible is not interested in a porous cosmos where divine and human lines casually mingle and produce semi-divine culture heroes. The ancient Near East had many stories like that. Kings could claim heavenly descent, giant ancestry could become prestige, sacred knowledge could be traced to beings between worlds. Genesis moves against that impulse. Even when it includes the strange episode of the sons of God, it does so briefly and without glamour. The flood closes that chapter. The covenantal history that follows will root humanity not in secret divine mixtures, but in accountable human generations under one God. A hidden fourth son would threaten that moral architecture. He would keep the boundary breach alive in the very genealogy meant to restore order. He would suggest that the old age was not judged cleanly, and that the line between sacred election and cursed inheritance remains tangled from the start. It is not hard to see why a tradition-building communal identity around Torah would give such an idea no room in its central text. That does not require a dramatic erasure. Communities exclude plenty of material simply by not canonizing it, not repeating it liturgically, not weaving it into their main teaching line. One set of stories becomes scripture, others become commentary, sectarian memory, folklore, or rumor. Over time, the center hardens and the margins grow wild. The fourth son belongs to those margins. He was not necessarily cut out with a knife. He may simply never have been allowed into the house. And yet the margins are where a tradition often reveals what it finds hardest to settle. The very fact that Jewish and neighboring communities kept revisiting giants, forbidden knowledge, Canaan, and alternate survival shows that Genesis did not answer every question in a way that silenced imagination. Canon gives shape, but it does not end thought. In fact, strong canon often provokes strong interpretation, because readers trust the text enough to wrestle with its silences. Theologically, that may be the deepest meaning of the hidden son. He represents the part of sacred history that communities fear because it suggests evil is not only an act but an inheritance. It can be named, judged, and still return in changed form. The flood then becomes not a final solution but a demonstration. God can cut history, but human rebellion has roots that run deeper than catastrophe. A new beginning is real, yet it is not simple. The hidden son says exactly what official theology would rather say more carefully. By the time later interpreters imagined underground passages, unrecorded offspring, or giant survivors feeding after the flood, they were speaking to that same anxiety. Can a world truly begin again? Can judgment create purity, or only limit damage for a time? Can covenant history remain clean when human history never is? Genesis answers with order, promise, and named lines. The traditions of the fourth son answer with suspicion. They suspect that what the text contains as moral truth, the wider memory of the world keeps breaking open as narrative tension. That is why the mystery has lasted. It is not only about what happened before the waters fell. It is about whether any sacred beginning can stay untouched by what came before. Chapter 8. In the end, the fourth son of Noah stands where some of the most haunting biblical questions always stand. Between text and memory, between judgment and survival, between what God ends and what human beings carry onward anyway. He may never have existed as a literal son, erased from an older version of Genesis. The evidence for that is too thin, too late, too unstable. But as a figure in the imagination of those who lived with the flood story, he is profoundly real. He gathers into one body the unease that ancient readers felt when they looked at the world after the waters and saw too much of the old world still alive. That is why the mystery cannot be reduced to a trivia question about names. It reaches into the core meaning of the flood. If Noah's household was the seedbed of a cleansed humanity, why does violence return so quickly? Why do cities rise with pride still in their foundations? Why do giant peoples haunt the edges of the promised land? Why does the curse of Canaan feel like the reappearance of something older than a family quarrel in a tent? Why does civilization seem to recover not only life, but ambition, hierarchy, and dangerous brilliance? The hidden son is one ancient way of asking all of that at once. Perhaps that is also why the story remains attractive now. Modern people are not only curious about lost books and suppressed traditions, they are skeptical of clean endings. They know revolutions do not erase old habits. They know disasters do not purify the human heart. They know that after every collapse, the builders return carrying tools forged before the fall. In that sense, the fourth son feels believable even before he feels historical. He gives narrative form to a truth people recognize in themselves. What should have ended often survives inside the survivors. But the Bible's own answer, even without a fourth son, may be sharper than the legend. Genesis does not need a secret bloodline to explain the return of evil. It places the problem in the human heart. After the flood, God says the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. That is more severe than any conspiracy of hidden offspring. It means the ark can save bodies without remaking nature. It means judgment can restrain violence without exhausting sin. It means the old world returns because the people of the new world are still human. The mystery of the fourth son externalizes that fear into genealogy. Scripture, in its harder honesty, turns the fear back on everyone, and still the legend serves a purpose. It forces us to slow down around the flood story and hear its unresolved echoes. It reminds us that ancient readers were not passive. They noticed the giants, they noticed the curse, they noticed the neighboring flood tales and the old stories about forbidden arts. They asked whether all corruption really died in the deep. Their answers were sometimes wild, sometimes sectarian, sometimes brilliant, sometimes reckless. But their questions were alive, and a living tradition often leaves more truth in its dangerous questions than in its safest slogans. So we return to that imagined moment at the ark. Rain on wood, a door closing, Noah looking back. Did he call for a son? Genesis never names. We do not know. The canonical text does not say it, and honesty requires us to leave that silence intact. Yet the silence itself has spoken for centuries. It has spoken through giant kings and cursed lines, through desert scrolls and late Mesopotamian sects, through half-trusted books and stubborn folklore. It has asked whether the world after judgment was ever as simple as 3 names and a rainbow. Maybe that is the final reason this mystery endures. The flood story is not only about destruction, it is about what remains. What remains of guilt, what remains of memory, what remains of skill, what remains of rebellion, what remains of mercy. The fourth son, whether history or symbol, stands among those remains. He is the shape given to an old suspicion that human history never starts from a blank page, not even after the waters cover everything. And perhaps that is what makes the story worth hearing, with care rather than with appetite for scandal. If the hidden son is only a legend, it is still a legend born from serious questions. If he is a symbol for the most uncomfortable continuity in the Bible. The fact that judgment alone cannot heal what humanity is. The ark lands, the earth dries, the altar burns, the rainbow appears, and yet the long work of history begins again, under the same sky, with the same heart, and with mysteries that no flood has fully washed away.